I want to say I've been chewing on this BBC for days. Days. And I was still rewriting it 15 minutes ago, and I've decided to throw it out. So I think I'll just talk and hope it comes out right. We'll see. But I think the thing that's been up, a combination of things in working on the organization plans, what are we about? Where do we come from? Hearing people's thoughts about what works and what doesn't work. So there's that piece of it. And then also in the midst of that conversation, I heard someone say, we're not even sure what the Abbey's core values are, or we couldn't name them. I thought, really? Well, what are our core values? There's lots of things on the website. We have this list, but it boiled right down to our core values are Buddhist core values. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your mind completely. This is a teaching of the Buddha. That's really the core value of the Abbey. And so, and there's different ways that gets expressed. It gets expressed in terms of, it's holiness, boils it down to two. The essence of Buddhism is interdependence, nonviolence, wisdom, compassion. Or we talk about it in terms of the three higher trainings, the training in ethics, which is the absolute foundation for the training in concentration, which is the foundation for the training in wisdom. And so at the monastery level, we're at the ethics level. This is what we're about. Because, following the Buddha's guidelines and all the principles that the Buddha, or the precepts that the Buddha gave over the course of time, they're all about subduing our mind. They're all about training us to not commit any non-virtuous actions of body, speech, and mind, to do our best to cultivate virtue, body, speech, and mind, and to subdue our minds. And a part of ethics is also cultivating compassion and kindness for others. So it's the Mahayana ethical code is not just to not harm, it's also to be of benefit. So all that kind of comes together, and this is the purpose of being in the monastery. So I think we could look at any of those things as a value statement and say that's what we're about. And so in setting up things, the way the schedule goes, Venerable Children says that we're always going to rail against the schedule. We're going to rail against the liturgy or the practices. We're going to rail against the food. And that's it. Those are the three main things. Those are the things we're going to rail against that we just know that we get here. It's also true that we're going to rail against the people that we're living with. Let's be honest. And that's where we get to work on our working not to do any destructive actions, working on trying to be a benefit, working on subduing our minds. But the other place we're going to rail is against the teacher. And that's what I've really been thinking about in the last few days. Because whose job is it to point out our faults? The teachers. Who want their faults pointed out? Nobody. Even we come here willingly saying, I want to change, we don't want to have our faults pointed out. So it's easy, and it's really kind of the teacher's role to be the thing that we push against, the thing that we get angry at, the thing we get attached to, their praise, their approval, they're thinking we're a good monastic, they think we're a good student, they give us nice jobs, that kind of attachment. And then all the anger that we put out in response to having our faults pointed out, and also in response to having situations that we're not happy about. Because who made up this schedule? The teacher. Who brought in these rules? The teacher. Who set up the guidelines that said, this is what we're supposed to do, this is what we're not supposed to do? Well, the teacher did. So even indirectly, when we're fighting against the things that cross our desires to be happy, that's what it boils down to. It's kind of railing against the teacher. So what this has brought me to is thinking, it's always, I think, very awkward for the teacher to talk about and teach the topic on how to rely on a spiritual mentor. So it falls to others, I think, to share that thinking. And as I've been looking at how we've been thinking about the redesign, which I'm quite excited about, I'm not dissing that in any way. It's just bringing up these real thoughts about the extent to which we trust. The structure of the monastery is dependent on the extent to which we trust the teacher. And trust with the teacher is not something that just comes automatically. You can't just read a book and say, oh, I am so inspired by the way this person thinks, I want to go be their student and have immediate trust. Because trust is a whole other thing. You can't just listen to them speak and say, wow, I want this person to be my teacher, and then have the kind of trust that is willing to let them point out your faults. That's the level I'm talking about, right? So this trust or this confidence, in some way it's implied. We come here, we're checking out the scene, we think we're going to stay. So that implies a level of trust has been developed. But it gets much more, it gets tested then as we come up against, why did that decision get made? Why am I not allowed to do this thing that I want to do? How come I have to do this? This is a stupid rule. Who made this one up? All the things that come up in our minds, and I'm saying this from my own experience, not because of anything I've heard from anybody else's mouth. But these things arise in our mind, and our willingness to accept and go on, in my experience, is dependent on the trust we have in the teacher who made them up, who is guiding this ship. So I wanted to talk about just some really simple, fundamental things. It's our job to develop the trust. It's not the teacher's job to become trustworthy. Presumably, that has already been done. And presumably, we've checked out enough to see that we believe that person has done some work to become trustworthy. So this developing the confidence that says, yeah, I can follow this rule. I don't like it, but I understand, I trust this person's motive is one of compassion. I trust this person's motive is to help transform my mind. I trust this person wants me to become a Buddha. And we all have areas where we do trust, and we all have areas where we've hit the wall and don't. My own wall-hitting moments have been excruciating, I will say. Sometimes I'm surprised when I hit a wall when the teacher comes up with something that I didn't know was her responsibility, by God. That part is none of her business, right? That's the place where my trust isn't developed. And it still happens, less and less. But I wanted to go to, Lama Tsongkhapa is so clear in Lamrim Chenmo when he tells us how to cultivate this trust and confidence in the teacher. And so I just wanted to review it again as a way to continually, I don't think we can ever stop. In the West in particular, we have no framework for what this relationship is. This person is not a parent. This person is not a boss. This person is not a priest like in any other religion. It's not really a minister like any other religion. The spiritual mentor is the person that we're relying on to guide us all the way to awakening. So we have to have some trust in in their motivation, in their own good qualities, and then develop that willingness or that wish to follow their direction because we trust them. Not because it's a police thing. Not because you have to sign on the dime and make a contract, but because that trust comes from a deep sense of our own practice of having examined their qualities again, 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 again. Developing our confidence in their motivation because we've examined their qualities again, 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 and again, and again. And then slowly, it takes time, years, decades maybe, to develop into really surrendering to that. So Maitreya, in Ornament for the Mahayana Sutras, lays out the very famous 10 qualities of a qualified spiritual mentor. So he says, rely on a Mahayana teacher who is disciplined. That's practicing ethics. Pacified, so his concentration is developed. Thoroughly pacified, has an understanding, ideally a realization, of the nature of reality itself. Has good qualities surpassing those of the student. Is energetic. Has a wealth of knowledge of the scriptures. Has loving concern. Has thorough knowledge of reality. Has skill in instructing disciples. And has abandoned becoming dispirited or discouraged. That's an impressive list. They say, of course, in this degenerate time, it's hard to find somebody with all 10 of those. But, at certain levels, we can probably name some people that have some portion of all 10 of these. So then, thinking about, does the teacher have these qualities? To what extent does the teacher have these qualities? Why are these qualities important? That's an object of our own meditation. Why are these important, and what does that have to do with me and my practice and my relationship with the teacher? And then as we come to think about those things, then we rely on the teacher by way of respect, which means thinking about their good qualities. Again. Not thinking about their faults, which is harder. It's nice to think about the good qualities. It's harder not to pick at the faults. But Lama Tsongkhapa is very clear. He says, if you let your mind get into that habit, it will really kill your practice. Stop it. He just says, don't do it. Stop. And it's not, he also later clarifies it. It says it's not that the teacher may or may not have faults. It's not like we're trying to gloss over something that may or may not exist. But for the sake of our own mind, what's important to us? They're good qualities. Their good qualities are what benefit us. And so we think of those again, and that becomes the bigger picture in our own mind. Because when we're looking at the faults of anybody, how much is the fault actually objectively in that person, or how much is it in our perception or story about the person? Hard to tell sometimes. And how much does it benefit us to actually pick up the faults of the person that we're trying to lead us to enlightenment? Not going to get very far. So it's a mind training of our own way of seeing things. And as we practice that with the teacher, of course, then we get better and better at practicing it with others as well. So that when we meditate on the kindness of sentient beings, we're practiced at meditating on the kindness of the teacher, whose kindness we can pretty much verify. Other people, maybe not so easy to see, but if we start to look, we'll find that too. So we practice all of that on the teacher. So we rely on the teacher in our thoughts by thinking in this way and then allowing our gratitude to come up. The more we cultivate that feeling of appreciation for their good qualities, their appreciation for what they do for our spiritual development, the appreciation for what they do for the development of other people, the more our gratitude arises. The more our gratitude arises, the more we see their kindness. The more we see their kindness, the more gratitude we have, the more we start to trust. So that when we have difficult moments with the teacher, and we will, we've signed up for it by moving here, and then we put this on. We've signed up. But when we do, the deeper our foundation, the deeper our confidence and trust in the person who's guiding us. The more we'll learn, the faster we'll be able to turn, and I would say the faster we move on the path to awakening. So relying them with our thoughts in that way, and then we also rely on them with our actions. We rely on them by making offerings then. We rely on them by offering service for the projects they've asked us to do. Not necessarily the projects we want to do, but the projects that support their efforts in the way that they've set up that those requests are made. And then we also rely on them with our practice. So by practicing what they've taught, by, the demonstration is how the schedule is set up, doing the practices, doing the retreats, all of those things, and ultimately in transforming our minds. Because on another side, there's a quote, I didn't pull it out of here, but it has kind of haunted me almost my whole Dharma life, that Lama Tsongkhapa quotes, where I think it's Geshe Podowa, who says, "Every time a student arrives, my burden grows. When the student leaves, my burden decreases." And I think sometimes looking at our teacher, I go, well, But the willingness, back to those qualities, the willingness to take on that burden is something quite huge. And it's not that we can make ourselves super, 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 super good so we won't be the burden. I've tried it. And I've apologized many times for, being the pain that I am in regard to my teacher, who says, "It's my job, it's okay." Not, please be rude to me again. She's not saying that. But at the point of the apology, to be able to recognize that this is what comes up in relation to our teacher. More than anybody else, wanting their approval, wanting their praise, or being so angry at them for getting in our way, or not thinking that we're who we think we are, comes up. So I want to encourage all of us, actually, as we're going through this process, to not neglect the Lamrim meditations on how to rely on a spiritual mentor. And I would especially say for people who have not known Venerable Children for very long, it will support tremendously that relationship to really look at the meditations, really think about them. There's no right or wrong answer to any of these questions, like, does this person help me or not? How does this person help me? La, 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 la. But to get clear in our own minds what that relationship is, I think it will make things smoother along the way. And for sure, when there are bumps, as there will be, they get cleaned up faster, the greater confidence we have in that person as our guide. Because if we trust that person as our guide and we trust their motivation, then we don't have anything to lose in being in a clean, clear relationship with them. So that's what I wanted, basically, to say. And I'll refer you to Lama Tsongkhapa. That section is quite clear. Yeah. I will say this with one caveat. This is not a topic that Venerable Children likes very much, because there's a lot of language in there about relying on the teacher like a dog, or there's this whole set of similes that are a little bit tough for the Western mind. So don't necessarily take those literally. But do think about the advantages of relying on the spiritual mentor, the disadvantages of not properly relying on the spiritual mentor. Think about the kind of karma we create in regard to the spiritual mentor. They're a huge field of merit for us, and also a huge field of negativity. If our anger or our unskillful, harmful behaviors are directed at the teacher, it's heavier than if they were done to me, for example. And anyway, see how that helps our practice. And then see how it helps our life and community. Yeah, you have a question?
Your talks just reminding me of when there was a period when I had a very hard time around, my relationship with Venerable Children. And something that helped me was this quote from a Zen master in one of those Dharma magazines, but it just stuck. It said, how much you trust your teacher depends on how much you trust yourself. Or one of these koan type things, right, that I just really sat with for a long time. Mm-hmm. And maybe the opening was more about, really that relationship is a lot like a mirror. It reflects back a lot more what is going on within myself than necessarily who I imagine that person to be. So that was the way I broke through that doubt, I would say, or that helped me to find my bearings in the Dharma around that. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. Thank you. The other thing that comes from the Zen tradition, and probably is also true, I can't remember the exact quote, but also whenever we're having trouble with the teacher, it's also blocking our relationship with the Buddha, which I have found to be useful. Very useful. Okay.